The day Mary Talmadge rode into Redemption Creek with nothing but a carpetbag, a loaded derringer, and a letter promising her a new life. She had no idea that the dusty, sun-scorched town would become the place where her heart finally learned to beat again. She had come from St. Louis, Missouri, in the spring of 1874, answering an advertisement posted in the back pages of the Missouri Democrat. The advertisement had been simple enough. 3 lines of plain print seeking a schoolteacher for a frontier settlement in the New Mexico Territory, offering room and board and a modest wage of $20 a month. Mary had read those 3 lines 7 times before cutting them out with a pair of scissors and pressing them flat between the pages of her Bible. She had nothing left in St. Louis. Her mother had passed the previous autumn from consumption. Her father had drunk himself into an early grave 2 years before that, and the small boarding house where she had been living had raised its rates beyond what her seamstress work could sustain. She was 24 years old, unburdened by family, and frightened in the way that only truly free people can be frightened, with no one to catch her if she fell. The stagecoach had taken 4 days from Santa Fe to Redemption Creek, rattling across red rock canyons and sage-covered flatlands, while Mary pressed her forehead against the dirty window glass and tried to memorize the shape of a landscape she had never imagined. The territory was nothing like Missouri. It was vast in a way that made her chest ache, full of color and silence, and a kind of ancient patience that the crowded streets of St. Louis had never known. She watched hawks circle above the mesas and told herself that she was brave. She was not sure she believed it. Redemption Creek itself was smaller than she had anticipated. A main street of hard-packed earth ran between 2 rows of wooden buildings, their false fronts painted in fading reds and yellows that the sun had done its best to strip away. There was a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Silver Spur, a small white church with a crooked steeple, a jailhouse with rusted bars on its single window, and a scattering of adobe homes stretching out into the surrounding desert. The schoolhouse stood at the eastern edge of town, a squat adobe building with a plank door, and a hand-painted sign that read Redemption Creek School in letters that had been done with great enthusiasm and slightly uneven skill. Mary stepped down from the stagecoach with her carpetbag and tried not to show how her knees were trembling. The man who met her was Eldon Briggs, the town alderman, a round-faced man in his 50s with a gray beard and the permanently sunburned look of someone who had spent decades outdoors. He shook her hand with both of his and told her that the town was grateful she had come, that the last teacher had left in December after the cold got into his lungs, and he had decided he preferred dying in a warmer climate, and that the children had been running half-wild since. Mary thanked him and asked to see the schoolhouse. She spent her first night in Redemption Creek in the small room Eldon had arranged for her above the general store, belonging to the widow Hannigan, who had 3 cats and a habit of singing hymns while she cooked. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street. Mary sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the town settling into evening, the distant laughter from the Silver Spur, the whinny of horses in the livery, the low conversation of men on the porch of the general store below. She was alone and far from everything she had known, and she told herself firmly that this was not a tragedy. This was a beginning. She met Frederick Conroy on her 3rd morning in Redemption Creek. She had gone to the general store to purchase chalk, a box of pencils, and a length of ribbon to hang a map of the United States at the front of the classroom. The store smelled of leather and coffee and the sharp chemical scent of lamp oil. Behind the counter stood a young woman named Della, who was clearly the owner's daughter, and browsing the shelves near the window was a tall man whose back was turned to the door when Mary entered. He turned when he heard the bell above the door jingle, and Mary's first impression was of someone who had been made for the outdoors. Frederick Conroy was 27 years old, with dark brown hair that fell across his forehead, in a way he had clearly given up arguing with, and gray eyes the color of a sky before rain. He was lean in the way that working men are lean, broad through the shoulders and narrow at the waist, wearing worn canvas trousers, a blue chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and boots that had seen considerable country. He was holding a paper sack of coffee beans and looking at her with an expression that was politely curious and nothing more. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Mary said, and moved toward the counter. That should have been that. Two strangers in a small store exchanging the basic courtesies of frontier life and going about their separate business. But then Della behind the counter said, "Miss Talmadge, that's Frederick Conroy. He has the ranch 3 miles out on the western road. Mr. Conroy, this is Miss Mary Talmadge, our new schoolteacher." And Frederick Conroy set down his coffee beans and extended his hand across the counter display of buttons and thread, and Mary shook it. His handshake was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who respected the person on the other side of it. "Welcome to Redemption Creek," he said. "We've needed a teacher since the first of the year." "So I've been told," Mary said. "Do you have children in school, Mr. Conroy?" "No," he said. "No children. My younger brother's boy comes in from the next property over. Thomas, he's 8. I'll be sure he arrives on time." "I'd appreciate that." He picked up his coffee beans and his hat from the top of a barrel of flour and nodded to her with a courtesy that felt old-fashioned in the best possible way and walked out into the morning light. Mary watched him go for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then turned to Della and asked for her chalk. The first weeks of school were harder than Mary had anticipated and more rewarding than she had hoped. There were 14 children enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 13, of wildly different backgrounds and abilities. Several came from ranching families, a few from the small Mexican-American community on the south side of town, and one, a solemn girl named Esperanza, who walked 4 miles each way from an isolated homestead because her mother had decided that an education was worth any amount of walking. Mary worked from sunup to well past dark, writing lesson plans by candlelight, and then rising before dawn to walk the 1/4 mile to the schoolhouse to lay the fire before the children arrived. She saw Frederick Conroy only in passing during those first weeks. He came to town every Thursday for supplies, and sometimes she would see him on the main street when she was walking to the store or the church. He always tipped his hat and said good morning or good afternoon, and she always returned the greeting with a smile that she hoped was appropriately professional and not too warm, and then they went their separate ways. She learned pieces of his story from Della and from the widow Hannigan, who knew everything about everyone in Redemption Creek, because she had been there since before the town was officially a town. Frederick Conroy had come to the New Mexico Territory from Kentucky when he was 21, following his older brother James, who had taken up a land grant under the Homestead Act of 1862. James had built up a respectable cattle operation on 320 acres of good grazing land along the creek that gave the town its name, and when he died of a rattlesnake bite 3 years later, the ranch passed to Frederick, who had been working it alongside him. James had been married, and his wife Alina and their son Thomas had stayed on the neighboring property that James had put in Alina's name for security. Frederick looked after them both, supplementing their income from the cattle and visiting often, filling the role of brother and uncle with a quiet steadiness that everyone in Redemption Creek had noticed and respected. He was, by all accounts, a good man, not a flashy man, not a man who made himself known through noise or swagger, but the kind of man who kept his word and paid his debts and showed up when people needed him, which in the end counted for considerably more. It was the second Thursday in May, when their acquaintance moved past politeness. Mary had been carrying a stack of McGuffey's readers to the schoolhouse after picking them up from the stagecoach delivery, when one of the leather straps on her carpetbag snapped without warning, sending 6 readers sliding into the mud of the main street. She was in the middle of crouching to gather them, her practical calico dress already streaked with the territory's red dust, when Frederick appeared beside her and crouched down too, picking up 3 of the books before she had retrieved the first. "Thank you," she said, flustered. "You've got more than a person ought to carry alone," he observed, not critically, just as a statement of fact. "The delivery came in all at once, and Della's father was busy with a shipment at the store," she explained, which was more explanation than he had asked for, and she knew it. He stacked the rescued readers together, straightened up, and looked at the remaining pile in her arms. "Can I carry those to the schoolhouse for you?" She hesitated. She was a single woman in a frontier town, and she was aware of how quickly impressions formed and calcified in small communities. But she was also practical, and her arms were already aching, and Frederick Conroy's expression was so entirely without guile or intention that refusing would have been more awkward than accepting. "That would be very kind," she said. They walked the quarter-mile to the schoolhouse together, and for the first half of the walk neither of them said anything, which should have been uncomfortable and was somehow not. The morning was cool and bright, the desert air carrying the clean smell of sage and somewhere beyond it the sweetness of blossoming cholla. A roadrunner crossed their path ahead of them, and Frederick slowed to watch it go, with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. "Have you gotten used to it yet?" he asked. "Used to what?" "The size of it, the territory. Some people from back east take a while." Mary thought about this honestly. "I think I'm still surprised by it every morning," she said. "I'll look out the window and the sky is so big that it startles me, but I think I mean that in a good way." He considered this. "Kentucky's beautiful country," he said. "Green in a way nothing out here is green, but I've never once thought about going back." "What made you stay?" she asked, and then wondered if the question was too personal, but he answered it without hesitation. "The space," he said simply, "and the work. You can build something real out here. The land doesn't lie to you." She thought about that for the rest of the day. The social life of Redemption Creek centered on 2 events: church on Sunday morning, where Reverend Alcott delivered sermons of variable length and consistent sincerity, and the monthly town social held in the open-sided pavilion behind the church, where families brought covered dishes, and the Garza brothers played fiddle and guitar until the stars came out. Mary attended both, because she understood that a schoolteacher's place in a frontier community was partly practical and partly ceremonial, and because she genuinely liked the people she was meeting. It was at the May social that she and Frederick Conroy had their first real conversation. He found her at the edge of the gathering, where she had retreated briefly from the heat and noise to breathe cooler air and watch the dancers. The Garza brothers had started a lively polka, and the small dirt dance area had filled with couples, including Della and a young man from the livery who was clearly besotted with her, and Alina Conroy, Frederick's sister-in-law, dancing with her son Thomas, who was standing on her shoes and grinning with absolute delight. "He's a good boy," Mary said, nodding toward Thomas. Frederick came to stand beside her holding a tin cup of lemonade. He watched his nephew with an expression that was purely fond. "He is, stubborn as anything but good. He's making real progress in his reading. He's going to surpass the older children by the end of summer if he keeps at it." Frederick looked at her then. "You mean that?" "I do. He has a hungry kind of mind. It's a pleasure to teach a child like that." There was something in the way he looked at her then, grateful and surprised in equal measure, that made Mary's chest do something she was not entirely prepared for. She looked back at the dancers. "Alina seems well," she offered. "She has her hard days," he said quietly. "James has been gone 2 years now, but she's strong. I can see that she is." The fiddle shifted to something slower and sweeter, and for a moment the music was the only conversation between them. Then Frederick Conroy turned to her and said, with the directness she was coming to recognize as characteristic of him, "Would you dance with me, Miss Talmadge?" She turned to look at him, and his expression was earnest and slightly uncertain in a way that she found entirely disarming. "I would," she said. He was not a showy dancer. He was careful and steady, leading with a calm confidence that made her feel entirely secure, and he held her at the proper formal distance, his hand light at her waist. But they were close enough that she could see the gray in his eyes more clearly, close enough to notice that the concern and gravity that normally lived in his face had softened into something gentler in the lantern light. "You're not from ranch country," he said. "St. Louis. My father worked in the printing trade. Do you miss it?" "I miss my mother," she said honestly. "She passed last year, but the city itself not as much as I expected. I'm sorry about your mother." "Thank you." The song ended and they stepped apart, and Mary thanked him, and they rejoined the gathering. And for the rest of the evening they were simply two people among many at a community social. But something had shifted, quietly and without announcement, like the territory itself shifting between seasons, not dramatically but thoroughly. June arrived with its tremendous heat, and Mary learned the rhythms of a desert summer. She started school an hour earlier to make use of the cooler morning, and the widow Hannigan taught her to hang wet cloth over the windows to bring the temperature down, a technique that worked with modest effectiveness. She was happy. She realized one evening, sitting on the step outside her room with a glass of water, watching the sun drop behind the western mesas in sheets of orange and deep red. She was genuinely, specifically happy in a way she had not expected to be. Frederick came to the school on a Tuesday morning in the first week of June to drop Thomas off in person because the boy's horse had thrown a shoe and they had ridden together. He had to return to the ranch immediately but lingered for a moment at the door of the schoolhouse while the children settled, and Mary saw him look around the room with a careful attention, taking in the map she had hung at the front, the careful rows of desks, the shelf of readers, the multiplication tables written on the slate board in her precise handwriting. "You've made it into something real," he said. "It was already something real," she said. "It just needed a bit of attention." He looked at her, and there it was again, that thing she was having increasing difficulty naming and decreasing success ignoring. "I was wondering," he said, and then stopped. He started again. "There's a section of the creek that runs along the north edge of my land. It's shaded this time of year by the cottonwoods. Some of the children in town go out there on Saturdays. I thought you might want to see it. The territory is beautiful out there in the morning before the heat sets in." A pause. "Thomas has been wanting to show you his horse, if that's a reasonable excuse." Mary pressed her lips together to keep from smiling too broadly. "It's a perfectly reasonable excuse," she said. "He said he would arrange it with Alina, and that Thomas would be beside himself with excitement." He tipped his hat and left, and Mary turned back to her classroom where 14 children were waiting with varying degrees of patience, and she felt something warm and bright moving in her chest that she had absolutely no idea what to do with. The Saturday outing was everything it had been suggested to be. Frederick arrived with Thomas and Alina in a small wagon, and Alina immediately linked her arm through Mary's and talked to her with the easy warmth of a woman who had decided to like someone, and was doing so wholeheartedly. Alina was 29, dark-haired and dark-eyed, with a directness that Mary recognized as the particular forthrightness of someone who had survived genuine grief and come through it with her warmth intact rather than diminished. Thomas showed Mary his horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Captain, with the particular pride of a small boy who considers his horse to be the finest horse that has ever existed. Mary admired Captain with complete sincerity, and was rewarded with a tour of Captain's various excellent qualities delivered in the breathless, authoritative manner that only 8-year-old boys can fully achieve. They walked to the creek through the sage, Frederick slightly ahead, Thomas running back and forth between the adults, Alina keeping pace with Mary, and asking her about St. Louis and the school with genuine curiosity. The creek itself was everything Frederick had promised. It ran clear and cool over smooth red stones, shadowed on both sides by old cottonwoods whose leaves turned and flashed silver in the morning breeze. The sound of the water was extraordinary in the desert silence, clean and constant and entirely lovely. They sat on the bank and Alina and Thomas ate the food Alina had packed, and Mary pulled off her boots and put her feet in the cold water because Alina told her she absolutely had to, and Thomas immediately did the same, and then soaked the whole front of his shirt trying to catch a crayfish. Frederick sat on a flat rock nearby, arms resting on his knees, not talking much but present in a way that felt like company in itself. At some point in the late morning, Thomas had run off down the bank with a stick to investigate something he had spotted, and Alina had wandered after him with the unhurried patience of a mother who trusts her child but keeps him in sight. Mary and Frederick were left sitting side by side on the bank, and the cottonwood leaves moved above them and the creek ran over its stones, and the silence between them was the good kind, full rather than empty. "Thank you for this," Mary said. "I didn't know how much I needed to see something beautiful." "The territory has a way of surprising you," he said. "Just when you think it's only dust and hard work, it shows you something like this." She looked at him and found him already looking at her with those gray pre-storm eyes, and neither of them looked away. "Mr. Conroy," she said, and was aware that her voice was not entirely steady. "Frederick," he said, "please." "Frederick," she said, and the name felt right in a way she had not anticipated. "I think you should know that I have no intention of leaving Redemption Creek." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm glad to hear that." "I want to be honest with you," she said, "because I think honesty suits this place better than pretense. I like you. I have liked you since the moment you stopped to help me pick up those books without making it a performance of kindness. I like the way you look at Thomas. I like the way you said the land doesn't lie to you. I like more things than I probably ought to admit to a man I've known 6 weeks." She said all of this looking at the creek, and when she finished she made herself look at him, because she had said it and she would own it. Frederick Conroy was not a man who concealed things behind a practiced social face. What she saw in his expression was genuine and unguarded, and it made her heart turn over entirely. "Mary," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and it landed like something significant. "I have been trying to find a reason to come into town on days other than Thursday since the 2nd week of May." She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. He smiled, and she discovered that his smile was something she wanted to see as often as possible for the rest of her natural life. Thomas came running back down the bank carrying a piece of interesting rock and demanding that Mary evaluate its geological significance, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary and lovely afternoon around them, but it did not lose its weight. It sat between them for the rest of the day, warm and acknowledged and quietly, thoroughly wonderful. Frederick began coming to town on Tuesdays as well as Thursdays. He always had a credible reason related to the ranch or supplies or some errand for Alina, and Mary did not question the reasons because she was glad enough for the reality, which was that he would find her at the schoolhouse as she was finishing for the day, and they would walk together to the widow Hannigan's, stopping at the store sometimes, or at the church where she sometimes helped Reverend Alcott's wife with the Sunday school materials. They talked easily and at length about everything, about the territory and the school and his cattle and her students, about the books she was reading and the ones he had read, about Kentucky and Missouri, and what they had each imagined the West would be before they arrived, and what they had found instead. She learned that he was a man of serious convictions held without self-righteousness. He spoke with clear-eyed honesty about the injustices he had witnessed in the territory, the displacement of Pueblo and Apache people from lands they had held for generations, the way the land grant system benefited those with money and connections, and pressed hard on those without, the particular vulnerability of the Mexican-American families who had held land in the region for decades only to find their titles contested by Anglo settlers with political backing. He did not sermonize about these things. He simply named them as facts, as the truth of the place where they had chosen to make their lives, with the calm willingness to see clearly that she had come to consider one of his finest qualities. She told him things she had not expected to tell anyone in Redemption Creek, about her father's drinking and the particular shame of it, the way she had learned to be small and quiet when he was in a bad state, about the years she had spent caring for her mother while trying to keep herself economically afloat, the seamstress work in the cold back room of a dressmaker's shop. About the advertisement she had cut out of the paper and what it had meant to hold it in her hand, not just an opportunity but the specific feeling of possibility, of a life that might still have room in it for something other than survival. He listened to all of it without rushing her or reaching for easy consolation, which she recognized as a gift. In the last week of June, he asked if he could call on her formally. He asked with a seriousness that made her understand he meant it exactly as it sounded, not as a social convention, but as a genuine request, an acknowledgement that what was developing between them was worth the particular respect of being named. "Yes," she said, simply and without qualification. He called on her every Sunday after church. They would sit on the small porch at the Widow Hannigan's, which afforded them a view of the main street and the distant red mesas, and talk for 2 hours while the Widow Hannigan made a great show of being busy indoors and almost certainly listened to every word. Frederick brought her things he thought she might like: a pressed desert flower he had found near the creek, a small book of Western geography he had ordered from Santa Fe, once a perfect piece of turquoise he had found in a dry wash that caught the light in a way that made it look like bottled sky. Mary gave him things in return. She copied out poems she loved onto good paper and folded them into his hand when he left. She sent a tin of the molasses cookies she made with the Widow Hannigan, which he reported Thomas had helped consume at a rate that should have been medically alarming. She listened to him with the same wholeness with which he listened to her, which she had come to understand was not a small thing. It was at the August social, the big one that brought in families from ranches as far as 20 miles out, that things crystallized. The summer had been dry and hard. Frederick had lost a dozen head of cattle to the heat and a fence line to a flash flood in July, and he had spent the better part of 2 weeks repairing it in conditions that were brutal by any standard. He was tired in a way that showed around his eyes, but he was there at the social, helping set up tables and carrying benches with the other men. And when he found Mary helping Alina unload the food from the wagon, his face eased into something lighter the moment he saw her. Later, when the music had started and Thomas was asleep on a blanket under one of the tables with 3 other small children who had similarly succumbed to the evening, and Alina was sitting with a group of women friends laughing at something Mary could not hear, Frederick stood beside Mary at the edge of the lantern light and said, quietly, without preamble, "I love you, Mary." She had known it was coming, the way you know a storm is coming when the air changes quality before the clouds arrive. She had known her own heart for weeks, probably for longer than she had been willing to admit. And still, hearing him say it was something she had not entirely been prepared for, the plain and direct and completely unadorned way he said it, as though it were simply a true thing and he wanted her to know it was true. She turned to face him fully. "I love you too," she said. "I've been trying to be reasonable about it for 2 months." His exhale was something between a laugh and pure relief. He took her hand, which they had not done before, and held it without making it into anything more than what it was, which was already everything. "I'd like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not tonight. I want to do that properly. But I wanted you to know that's what I intend, so that what I'm asking when I ask you is nothing you're not already prepared for." She squeezed his hand. "I think I would like that," she said, "and I think I will say yes." The next 3 weeks passed in a state that Mary could only describe as suffused. Everything was the same, the school and the heat and the dust and the daily work of a frontier life, and everything was also lit from within by the knowledge of what was coming and what already was. She taught her students with more energy than ever. She helped Esperanza, who had become her particular favorite, prepare for an examination that would allow her to skip a full grade. She sat on the Widow Hannigan's porch in the evenings and watched the stars come out over the desert, which appeared in such quantities out here in the territory that they looked almost implausible, and thought about Frederick Conroy and the ranch 3 miles down the western road, and what a life looked like when it was built with someone you trusted absolutely. He proposed on the first Saturday in September, on the bank of the creek where they had first told each other the truth. He did not go down on one knee because the ground was uneven and he was, she had learned, deeply practical about such things. But he stood before her with both her hands in his and asked her if she would marry him and build a life here in the territory, on the land he had been working for 6 years, with Thomas nearby and Alina's friendship, and a community that was still becoming what it was going to be. "There are hard years ahead," he said honestly. "The cattle business is not consistent. There are wet years and dry years and years that are both in the wrong order. The work is real and sometimes brutal. The territory is not kind in every season." "I know all of that," Mary said. "And the school needs you," he said. "I would never ask you to give that up." She looked at him for a long moment. The cottonwoods moved above them and the creek ran beneath them and the sky was the particular endless blue of a New Mexico morning. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Frederick, yes." He kissed her then, the first time, careful and deliberate and warm, and she felt it all the way to somewhere very deep and settled, somewhere that had been waiting for this specific thing for a long time without knowing what it was waiting for. They set the wedding for October, which Reverend Alcott and the widow Hannigan both agreed was sensible because October in the territory was the finest month of the year, after the summer heat had broken, and before the cold moved in, when the light went golden and the cottonwoods along the creek turned a yellow so bright it almost hurt to look at. The 3 weeks between the engagement and the wedding were busy ones. Mary wrote to no one in St. Louis, because there was no one left to write to, but she felt the absence of family with a particular sharpness during the preparations. It was Alina who stepped into that space with so little ceremony that Mary did not even notice it happening until it already had. Alina brought fabric from her own stores, a deep blue wool that she said would suit Mary's coloring, and sat with her and the widow Hannigan 3 evenings a week altering it into a dress that was simple and right. Alina talked to her about James and about what marriage was in the hard country of the territory, what it required in terms of patience and honesty, and the willingness to depend on another person, which was its own kind of courage. "James was not a perfect man," Alina said one evening, her hands moving the needle through the blue wool with the efficiency of long practice. "But he showed up, every day, even the hard ones. That is what matters." "Frederick is that kind of man," Mary said. Alina looked up from her sewing and smiled. "He is the best man I know," she said, with a simplicity that carried the full weight of everything she had been through. "And you are exactly right for him. You meet him where he stands. Not everyone can do that." On the Friday before the wedding, a situation arose that the town had not anticipated. A man named Burl Dacey arrived in Redemption Creek, a land speculator from Albuquerque who had been buying up grazing rights throughout the territory with legal instruments of questionable legitimacy. And he presented Eldon Briggs with papers claiming a contested boundary on the land belonging to the Garza family, whose patriarch had held his deed for 30 years. The Garzas were the families that everyone in Redemption Creek knew and depended on. Their sons played music at every social. Their patriarch Pedro had helped build the schoolhouse, and the idea that their land might be stripped from them by a man in a city suit waving papers of dubious origin brought a particular fury to the town. Frederick went to see Eldon Briggs that same afternoon. Mary heard about it from Della, who had been at the store when Frederick stopped in, and she went herself to find out what was happening. What she found was Frederick and Pedro Garza sitting across from Eldon and Burl Dacey in the alderman's office, and the conversation was tense in the contained way of men who are choosing their words very carefully because they are aware of what the alternative is. Burl Dacey was the kind of man who used legal language the way other men used physical intimidation, as a weapon designed to create confusion and dependency. And Frederick was the kind of man who had learned enough about territorial land law to know when the weapon was being aimed falsely. Mary stood in the doorway and listened, And when Daisy cited a specific provision of the surveying code that she happened to know was wrong because she had read the territory's land statutes in her geographic survey book, the one Frederick had given her, she said so clearly from the doorway. Every head turned. "The survey of 1869 supersedes the provision you're citing," she said, meeting Daisy's startled look with complete calm. The General Land Office revised the boundary determination protocol for properties predated to the Mexican land grant period. The Garza deed falls under that revision. If you'd like to bring this before a territorial judge, I believe you'll find the Garza family's title is sound. There was a silence in which Burl Daisy's expression moved through several stages before settling on the particular look of a man who has realized that the room contains someone who has done their reading. Frederick was looking at her with something that she could only describe as wonder. Daisy packed his papers with stiff dignity and left Redemption Creek that afternoon. Pedro Garza shook Mary's hand with both of his, which reminded her so much of Eldon Briggs shaking her hand on the day she arrived that she almost laughed. And later, when she and Frederick were walking back toward the widow Hannigan's through the amber evening light, he took her hand in his and held it and said nothing for a full minute. "The land statutes," he said finally. "You gave me the book," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him, and his expression was so full and open that it made her breath catch. "Mary Talmadge," he said, "how did I manage 6 years in this territory without you?" She reached up and touched his face, which she had not done before, and he leaned into her hand slightly, and it was one of the most quietly profound moments she had ever experienced. "You managed it very well from what I can see," she said, "but I think we will manage it better together." The wedding day arrived with the particular magnificence of an October morning in the New Mexico territory. The sky was a blue of almost impossible depth, and the cottonwoods along the creek had turned their bright fall gold, and the air carried the clean, cool smell of coming winter that was still weeks away, and in the meantime was only beautiful. The whole town came. Mary had not expected the whole town to come, but Redemption Creek had apparently decided collectively that this was an event of significance and had acted accordingly. The women had decorated the church with late-season wildflowers and branches of the golden cottonwood leaves, and someone had hung a length of blue ribbon along the fence posts leading to the church door. And the Garza brothers were there with their fiddle and guitar, and Pedro Garza stood by the door with tears openly on his face that he made no effort to conceal. Mary walked to the church alone, which should have been lonely, and was instead a particular kind of freedom. She wore the blue wool dress that Alina and the widow Hannigan had made, with her dark hair pinned up and a small cluster of desert flowers at her collar that Esperanza had brought her that morning with grave, ceremonial seriousness. She carried nothing but herself, which had always been enough, and was now going to be given to someone who understood its value. Frederick was waiting at the front of the church. He had dressed with the same practical care he brought to everything, in a good black coat that she suspected he did not wear often and a clean white shirt, and he had done something about his hair that had mostly worked. He was watching the door when she came through it, and the expression on his face was one she knew she would spend the rest of her life being grateful to have caused. Reverend Alcott performed the ceremony with a warmth and lack of fuss that suited them both perfectly. The vows were the traditional ones, and Mary said them with total clarity and without a tremor, looking at Frederick while she did it because she was not going to look anywhere else. He said his with the same directness he brought to everything he said, each word placed with care and full intent. When Reverend Alcott pronounced them married, Thomas Conroy, seated in the front row between Alina and the widow Hannigan, let out a cheer that was completely audible and entirely sincere, and the whole church laughed, and Frederick kissed his bride with a warmth that was thoroughly proper and thoroughly real. They walked out into the October sunlight as husband and wife, and the Garza brothers started playing something bright and joyful, and Redemption Creek proceeded to celebrate in the way of small frontier communities, with food and music, and the particular happiness of people who live hard lives and understand therefore what celebrations are for. The first year of their marriage was exactly what Frederick had promised it would be, real and sometimes hard, and full of a richness that the hardness only deepened. Mary kept the school, which she had always intended to do, and which the community had always expected, because Redemption Creek had understood from the beginning that a schoolteacher's husband did not erase the schoolteacher. Frederick understood this with a particular clarity, and said so early in their marriage in a way that left no ambiguity. She moved into the ranch house on the western road, a good adobe structure with thick walls that kept it cool in summer and warm in winter, and she began the methodical work of making it a home, which was different from making it livable. It had been livable. Frederick was a tidy and practical man. But it had been missing the things that make a house into something more than shelter, and Mary added them by degrees: books on the shelves and a bright cloth on the table, and a kitchen garden along the south wall that through much trial and error she coaxed into producing good herbs and some decent vegetables. Thomas came to stay every Saturday, which was the arrangement that suited everyone. Alina would bring him in the morning and sometimes stay for midday dinner, and the four of them would sit around the table in the ranch house kitchen, with the door open onto the desert afternoon, and Mary would think about the word family and find it entirely adequate for what she meant. The winter of 1874 going into 1875 was cold and windy but manageable. Frederick's cattle herd came through it better than the previous year, partly because of improved winter preparations and partly because the grazing land along the creek held up, and by spring they had more calves than expected. Mary taught through the winter with the schoolhouse fire roaring and the children pressed together for warmth, and Esperanza passed her advanced examination and became, at 11 years old, the most academically accomplished student in the school's brief history, a fact Mary reported to her parents with a formality that made them look stunned and then entirely radiant. In the spring, Mary discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Frederick on a Tuesday morning in April while they were having coffee in the kitchen, and his expression cycled through surprise and then a deep, quiet joy that settled into his face and stayed there. "Are you well?" was his first question. "I'm very well," she said, "a little sick in the mornings, but very well." He set down his coffee and came around the table and held her with a care that acknowledged the new and significant thing they were now responsible for together. "The school," she said, into his shoulder. "We'll manage," he said, "until you need to step back, and you'll know when that is." She taught until the end of July, when the combination of summer heat and the advanced stage of her pregnancy made the long walk to the schoolhouse inadvisable, and Reverend Alcott's wife, who had taught school herself before coming to Redemption Creek, stepped in with competent good humor. Mary spent August working in the kitchen garden and sewing and reading, and being visited with tremendous frequency by Alina and the widow Hannigan and Della, and various other women of the town who appeared with food and advice and company in quantities that were sometimes overwhelming and always touching. Their son was born on a cool September morning in 1875, delivered by the town's visiting doctor with Alina and the widow Hannigan in attendance, and Frederick in the front room managing his anxiety with a focused concentration that Alina later said was identical to the way he managed everything difficult, which was to say by being extremely still and paying very close attention. They named him James William Conroy, James for Frederick's brother and William for no one in particular, except that it was a name they both liked the sound of. He was a healthy, vigorous baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's decisive manner of communicating what he needed, which he did loudly and without reservation. Frederick held his son that evening with the particular expression of a man who has been surprised by the size of his own capacity for love. Mary watched him from her pillow, tired in the deep and satisfying way of someone who has accomplished something enormous. "Hello, James," Frederick said quietly, to the small face studying him from the blanket. I'm your father. I'll do my best to deserve it." Mary closed her eyes and felt everything in her settle into a rightness that had no edges she could find. The next 2 years built themselves steadily and well. James grew from an infant into a toddler into a small boy of astonishing energy and curiosity, who followed his father around the ranch asking questions at a rate that sometimes left Frederick visibly working to keep up. Thomas, now 10 and 11 and then 12, was the best of older cousin who acts like a brother, patient with young James in the way that children who have had good adults model patience for them often are, and Frederick watched the two of them together with a warmth that was impossible to fully articulate. Mary returned to school in the spring of 1876, bringing baby James to the schoolhouse for the first months in a basket because she could not stand the separation, and because the older children unanimously decided that tending the baby was an acceptable alternative to certain mathematics exercises, a bargain Mary allowed with more strategic regularity than she admitted. Esperanza, now 13 and fully the top of the class, became the baby's most dedicated guardian during school hours, holding him with the seriousness of someone taking on an important professional responsibility. The school grew that year. 3 new families settled in the area, bringing 6 additional children, and Mary applied to the Territorial Education Board for an assistant teacher and a larger building. The application process was longer and more bureaucratic than it had any right to be, involving 4 separate letters and 2 visits to the county seat in person, and Frederick accompanied her on both visits, driving the wagon the 40 miles each way, and sitting in the waiting rooms of territorial offices with James on his knee, reading whatever he had brought with the studied patience of a man who has decided that bureaucracy will not defeat him. The assistant teacher arrived in the fall of 1877, a young woman named Clara Hutchins from Taos, who was 21 and enthusiastic and deeply competent, and the new schoolhouse was approved the following spring. Pedro Garza and his sons built it in 3 weekends with lumber bought from the county allocation, and the whole town showed up to see it finished, which it was in time for the 1878 school year. It was during the construction of the new schoolhouse that Mary and Frederick had their only significant argument. Frederick had been working himself too hard that spring. The ranch, the schoolhouse construction, a fence issue on the south pasture, and Alina's roof, which had developed a serious problem after a late March storm, and Mary had been watching the tightness grow around his eyes and the quality of his tiredness shift from the good tired of hard work to the dangerous tired of a body that is being asked for more than it can sustain. She told him so directly at supper one evening, and he told her with equal directness that the work was not going to stop needing doing, and she told him that she understood that, but that she needed him to last more than a single season, and the conversation escalated to the point where Thomas, who was visiting, looked between them with wide eyes and very quietly took James outside. It lasted 20 minutes and resolved with Frederick sitting at the kitchen table and admitting that she was right, and Mary sitting across from him, and saying she knew the work was real and she was not asking him to do less than was necessary, only to ask for help when he needed it, which he was not doing, and him saying that he would try, and meaning it, and her saying she knew he meant it, and meaning that, and then they were quiet for a moment, and she reached across the table and took his hand. "I love you," she said. "That is why this conversation is happening." "I know," he said. "I love you too. That's why I'm listening instead of arguing." He asked for help the next week. Miguel Garza, Pedro's eldest son, came on to work the ranch part-time for wages that were fair and paid on time, and the quality of Frederick's tiredness shifted back toward the good kind, and Mary said nothing further about it except to be quietly and unmistakably grateful. In the summer of 1878, Esperanza came to Mary with news that the territorial school in Santa Fe was considering candidates for a scholarship for exceptional students, the sort of opportunity that was extraordinarily rare, and that Mary had been quietly working toward for 2 years without saying as much to anyone. Esperanza was 15 now, serious and brilliant and possessed of a hunger for knowledge that the Redemption Creek School had done its best to feed and had long since outgrown. Mary wrote the letter of recommendation herself, 6 pages long, the most precisely argued piece of writing she had ever produced. She cited Esperanza's academic record, her mathematical ability, her language facility, the essays she had written on territorial history and natural science. She sent the letter with the stagecoach to Santa Fe and then told Esperanza that they had to wait, which was the hardest part, and they did. The reply came in October. Esperanza was accepted. Mary read the letter on the school steps and cried, which she had not expected to do and which she had no interest in hiding. Esperanza, standing beside her, read it over her shoulder and was utterly still for a moment, and then began crying herself, which she clearly also had not expected. Frederick heard about it that evening when Mary came home and sat at the kitchen table with the letter and slid it across to him. He read it and looked up. "You did this," he said. "She did this," Mary said. "I just made the argument. You changed that girl's life." Mary looked at the window and the dark desert beyond it and thought about a girl who walked 4 miles each way to a schoolhouse because her mother had decided education was worth any amount of walking. "I hope so," she said quietly. They rode out to Esperanza's family's homestead the following Sunday, Mary and Frederick together in the wagon, to deliver the news in person and to talk with Esperanza's parents about what the scholarship meant in practical terms and how to make it work, which involved a number of logistical considerations that took the whole afternoon to work through. But by the time they drove back through the desert in the fall evening, everything was arranged, and Esperanza's mother had pressed Mary's hands between hers and said something in Spanish that Frederick translated quietly as, "She is thanking you for seeing her daughter clearly." Mary thought about that for a very long time. Their second child came in 1879, a girl they named Clara Rose Conroy, who arrived in February with a full head of dark hair and an expression of profound skepticism that she maintained for the better part of her first month, and eventually relaxed into a cheerful intensity that would characterize her for the rest of her life. James, 4 years old, received his sister with the diplomatic ambivalence of a small boy who has been told this is wonderful news and is still forming his own opinion. And Frederick held both of his children together on the afternoon of Clara Rose's second day, and looked at Mary with an expression that she had come to think of simply as his fullest face, the one he wore when his life exceeded what he had believed he was entitled to expect. "We're something, aren't we?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "We are," Mary agreed. The years moved in the way that happy years do, quickly when remembered, full when they were being lived. Redemption Creek grew through the early 1880s, slowly but with purpose, adding a doctor's office and a telegraph office and eventually a second general store, which caused considerable civic drama before everyone decided the competition was probably fine. The school grew too, and Mary taught in the new building with Clara Hutchins beside her, and the two of them developed a partnership and friendship that was one of the genuine pleasures of Mary's life. Thomas grew into a young man of 15, 16, 17, carrying more and more of the responsibility of Alina's ranch, with a seriousness and competence that made Frederick proud in the specific way of someone who has watched a child you love become exactly who you hoped they would be. Alina, for her part, had found in those years a quiet contentment, tending her land and her son and her friendship with Mary, which had deepened into the sort of relationship that needed no maintenance because it simply was. In 1881, a drought settled over the territory with the particular ruthlessness of nature in a landscape that has very little margin for error. It lasted through the summer and into the fall, and by August the creek had dropped to a thin thread between its banks and the grazing land was bare and brown, and the cattle were suffering. Frederick managed the crisis with the careful practicality that Mary had come to understand as his primary mode of dealing with difficulty, moving the herd to lower pastures, negotiating for water rights along a secondary stream, selling some cattle early rather than losing them to the drought, and keeping the books with a meticulous honesty about what the year was going to cost. Mary watched him manage it and felt, not for the first time, how different love looked when it was allowed to be long and steady. It was not what the songs described, not the urgent vertigo of first feeling, though that had been real too, and she still felt it in diluted but genuine form when he came in from a long day and touched the back of her neck as he passed her in the kitchen. What it had become was something more structural, load-bearing, something that held the weight of life. She brought the school through the drought year by taking advantage of the lower temperatures of the adobe building and organizing the older children into practical help for the community, carrying water and helping with gardens and learning in a context that made the learning feel like the useful thing it always was. She kept Esperanza's story alive in her classroom, the way teachers keep the stories of what students have achieved, as evidence of what is possible, and twice, that difficult summer, she received letters from Santa Fe that she read aloud to the class, because Esperanza wrote with a precision and beauty that deserved to be heard out loud. By October, the drought had broken. The rains came in a series of storms that turned the dry creek back to something approaching its normal self, and Frederick walked the fence lines of his property in the wet grass of the morning after the first real rain with the careful attention of a man taking an accurate accounting of where things stood. He came home that evening muddy and tired, and telling her straight that they had lost more than they had hoped to, but less than they had feared. "We'll be all right," he said. "I know," she said. "I never doubted that." He looked at her. "You're certain?" "Completely," she said. "I have been watching you work for 7 years, Frederick. I have never once doubted your ability to manage what this land throws at you. I have occasionally doubted your willingness to ask for help." He laughed, which she had intended. Miguel Garza had been invaluable during the drought, and Frederick had said so to his face, which was a form of growth she had observed and respected. The drought year was followed by 2 good years that the territory seemed to offer as an apology. The cattle herd rebuilt, the creek ran clear and full through both summers, and the school had its best enrollment since Mary had arrived. James, now 7 and 8, was attending the school where his mother taught with a complicated social dignity that he managed with better grace than Mary had expected. He was a bright child, not quite as academically driven as Esperanza had been, but curious and persistent, with his father's patience and his mother's tendency to state her opinion clearly. Clara Rose, at 3 and 4, was already a commanding presence in the ranch house, organizing the cats that had somehow accumulated, conducting serious negotiations about what would be eaten for supper, and following Frederick on his morning rounds with the absolute confidence of a child who has never once been made to feel that her presence is an inconvenience. Frederick treated her with the same unadorned respect he gave everyone, crouching down to her level when she spoke to him and listening with his full attention. And Mary watched this and thought about what it meant for a daughter to grow up with a father who believed she deserved to be taken seriously. It was in the fall of 1883 that Esperanza came back to Redemption Creek. She was 20 years old, and she had completed her studies at the Santa Fe school with distinction, and she had come back not because she had no other options, but because she had several and had chosen this one. She wanted to teach. She wanted to teach in Redemption Creek, in the school that Mary had built, where she had first understood what it was possible to know. Mary sat across from her in the schoolhouse after hours and listened to all of this with a feeling so large she was not entirely sure where in her body to put it. "I should tell you," Esperanza said, "that there is a position available in Santa Fe, at a much larger school with a better salary." "I know," Mary said. "I'm not taking it." "I know," Mary said again. Esperanza looked at her with the direct clarity that had always been her most remarkable quality. "You made this possible," she said, Not by doing it for me, by being willing to see it. Mary thought about Esperanza's mother's words, spoken in Spanish in a homestead kitchen years ago, about seeing her daughter clearly. She thought about the advertisement she had cut from the back of the Missouri Democrat in a cold boarding house room, and pressed between the pages of her Bible, the specific feeling of possibility it had carried. "You earned everything you've achieved," Mary said. "I wrote a letter. The work was entirely yours." "Then let me do work here," Esperanza said. "With you." Clara Hutchins was expecting her first child and would be stepping back in the spring, and the timing was what it was, perfect and right, and Mary said yes without hesitation. The evening after Esperanza's return, Mary told Frederick about it over supper, with James at the table doing his sums and Clara rose at Frederick's elbow being interested in his food. And Frederick listened and then said, simply, "This is what you came here to do." She thought about that. She thought about the stagecoach and the Red Rock canyons and the carpetbag with the broken strap and the stack of McGuffey's readers in the mud and the tall man who had stopped to help her pick them up without making it a performance. "Part of it," she said, looking at him. He met her eyes across the table with its bright cloth and the lamp burning warm above it, and he understood what she meant. Thomas Conroy, at 18, had become the kind of young man that makes the people who watched him grow up look at each other and nod. He ran his mother's ranch with a competence that had allowed Alina to ease into a less demanding role, and he came to Frederick regularly for counsel and advice in a way that was not dependency, but the genuine willingness to use the wisdom available to him, which Frederick said quietly to Mary was the thing he had most hoped to pass on. In 1884, Thomas met a girl at the Santa Fe Livestock Fair, the daughter of a Pueblo ranching family whose father had built up a successful cattle operation in the Northern Territory. Her name was Isabella, and she was 19, and Thomas came home talking about her with the particular inarticulate intensity that Mary recognized, because she had watched Frederick navigate the same state 10 years earlier. She suggested that Thomas write to Isabella and perhaps arrange for her to visit, practical counsel that Thomas received with enormous gratitude and acted on within the week. Isabella came to Redemption Creek in the spring of 1885, and what was notable about her arrival was how naturally she fit into the community, as though a space had been waiting for her that no one had noticed was empty. She had Alina's warmth and Thomas's steadiness in reverse proportion, and together they balanced each other in the way of people who genuinely complement rather than simply contrast. Mary and Frederick attended the wedding in October of 1885, riding to the Pueblo community in the Northern Territory for a ceremony that honored both of the families involved, two traditions given equal weight in the same celebration, which Mary thought was the right and honest way to do it. She held Frederick's hand during the ceremony and felt the familiar weight of his fingers between hers and thought, 11 years. She could feel all 11 years of it in that handhold, everything they had built and weathered and chosen. On the ride home in the wagon under an October sky that was producing stars at its usual implausible rate, the children asleep in the wagon bed behind them, James at 10 a solid presence wrapped in his blanket, Clara rose at 6 tucked against his side. Frederick drove the horses through the dark desert and said nothing for a comfortable while. "Then, do you remember the first time I spoke to you? In the general store," she said. "You said good morning." "I said morning," he corrected. "Not good morning, just morning," she laughed. "You're right, I embellished." "You were so self-possessed," he said. "I thought you were the most self-contained person I had ever seen. You walked in and you knew exactly what you needed and you went to get it." "I was terrified," she said. "I know that now. I didn't know it then. I just knew you were someone I wanted to talk to again." She leaned against his shoulder. The horses moved through the dark and the stars wheeled above the territory in their ancient, unhurried patterns, and the desert was cold and beautiful and thoroughly itself. 11 years, she said. 11 years, he agreed, and she could hear the texture of it in his voice, gratitude and something very close to awe. Frederick, Mary. Thank you, she said, quietly and specifically, meaning everything. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. Thank you, he said, meaning the same. Back in Redemption Creek, the life they had built continued to grow and deepen with the patient confidence of something well-rooted. Esperanza was teaching the younger children with a skill that had become evident immediately, and a dedication that made Mary proud in the particular, fierce way she had not anticipated when she first became a teacher. Esperanza was also writing essays and observations about the territory's history and its people that she sent to papers in Santa Fe and Albuquerque, and 2 were published, which caused considerable celebration in the school and the town generally. Clara Rose, at 7 and then 8, attended the school and was taught, to the complicated feelings of all involved, partly by her own mother and partly by Esperanza, whom she adored with the unreserved devotion of a child who has found an additional adult to admire. She was sharp and opinionated and physically fearless in a way that occasionally aged Frederick noticeably, climbing things she had no business climbing and arguing positions she was not always right about with a conviction she was never short of. Mary recognized in her daughter her own determination set at a slightly louder volume, and tried to model the patience with it that she hoped someone would one day model with James, who was thoughtful and quiet, and occasionally reminded her so precisely of Frederick at 27 that she had to look away. In 1887, the telegraph office expanded its connection to include Redemption Creek in a larger network, and the world became simultaneously smaller and more present. News arrived faster, including news of the territory's political changes and the ongoing complications of statehood discussions, and the continued injustices visited upon Native communities throughout the Southwest, which Frederick and Mary discussed at the kitchen table with the same clear-eyed honesty they had always applied to the harder truths of the place they lived. "This land has a complicated history," Mary told her students one morning, pulling down the map of the territory that now hung in the new schoolhouse with the same map-hanging ribbon she had bought on her first morning in town. "Understanding it is part of your responsibility as people who live here." She taught it without flinching, the displacement, the broken treaties, the ways in which the law had been used as a weapon against people who had fewer resources to fight it. She taught it alongside the stories of survival and culture and adaptation, because she believed history only made sense when you told the whole of it. The children listened, and some of them went home and talked to their parents, and some of those conversations were difficult, and some of them were illuminating, and Mary considered both outcomes to be the point. The winter of 1888 was the coldest the territory had seen in memory. The temperature dropped in December and stayed there, ice forming along the edges of the creek, and the desert plants retreating to whatever warmth they could find underground. Frederick kept the cattle fed at considerable labor and cost, and the family spent many evenings close to the fire in the ranch house kitchen, which was warm and full of light, with James doing his school reading at one end of the table, and Clara Rose drawing pictures of things she intended to make or do or be, and Frederick reading his own book or going over the ranch accounts, and Mary at her desk by the window writing her own things. The letters and notes and occasional longer pieces that she had found herself increasingly drawn to putting into words. She had been writing, in fits and starts, a kind of account. Not a memoir precisely, more a collection of observations about the territory and the school and the community, the kind of writing that Esperanza had encouraged her to formalize after reading some of the letters Mary sent to the Territorial Education Board. Mary was not sure what it was or whether it amounted to anything, but she was writing it, which was new. Frederick, reading over her shoulder one evening with his hand on her shoulder, had read 3 pages and said, "This is very good, Mary." "I don't know what it is," she said. "It's what this place looks like from the inside," he said. "Someone should write that down." She kept writing. In the spring of 1889, Esperanza published a longer piece in the Santa Fe New Mexican, a detailed account of the territorial school system and its inequities, specifically the ways in which children from Mexican American and Native communities had less access to educational resources than their Anglo counterparts. It was precise and documented and impossible to dismiss, and it caused a response that included both significant criticism from those it implicated and significant praise from those who had been waiting for someone to put it into print. Mary sent her a letter that was 2 pages of absolute pride and 1 paragraph of practical advice about responding to the critics, the sort of letter you write to someone you love and believe in completely. Esperanza came to supper the following Sunday, and they sat around the ranch house table, all of them, Alina and Thomas and Isabella, who was expecting their first child, and Esperanza, and James and Clara Rose, and Frederick and Mary, and the widow Hannigan, who was 80 years old and still singing hymns when she cooked, and who had established herself as so integral to the family's life that her presence at important suppers was simply assumed. The conversation around the table was everything that a good supper conversation should be, multiple threads running simultaneously, Thomas and Frederick talking cattle, Alina and Isabella talking about the coming baby, James asking Esperanza detailed questions about what it had been like to write for the newspaper, Clara Rose explaining at length a natural history observation she had made about a family of owls living in the old cottonwood nearest the barn, and the widow Hannigan saying periodically that someone needed more bread, and then providing it. Mary sat at her end of the table and watched all of it with a gratitude so specific and so thorough that it had no room for anything else. Frederick caught her eye from his end of the table, and she gave him the small smile that was only for him, and he gave it back, and it contained the 11 years of building this and the specific pleasure of looking at what had grown. Thomas and Isabella's son was born in August of 1889, a healthy boy they named James Frederick Conroy, the Frederick for his uncle, which made Frederick go quiet in a way that Mary understood completely. She held the baby at 3 days old and felt the weight of the continuing world in her arms, everything continuing past and through and beyond any single person's capacity to hold it. That fall, Mary finished her written account. She was not sure that was the right word for it, but she had written the last of what she intended to write and read it through and made her corrections, and it was done. It was 140 pages about a decade and a half in the New Mexico Territory, about education and community and the particular qualities of a desert landscape, and the people who had come to live in it and what they had built and what it had cost and what it had given them. She showed it to Frederick first, because she showed him everything important first. He read it over 2 evenings, sitting in the armchair by the fire with complete attention, and when he finished he set it on his knee and looked at her across the room. "Send this somewhere," he said. "It's not, send it to Esperanza's editor in Santa Fe," he said. "Let someone who knows what they're doing tell you what it is." She sent it. The reply came in January of 1890 from a publisher in Albuquerque who was interested in producing it as a book, which was a sentence that Mary read 3 times standing in the snow outside the post office before going back inside to make sure she had read it correctly. She had. She came home and told Frederick, who put down the harness he was mending and stood up and took both her hands and said, "There it is," with the specific satisfaction of someone whose belief in a particular thing has just been publicly vindicated. The book was published in the spring of 1890, a modest print run for a regional publisher, and it was reviewed in the Santa Fe New Mexican and the Albuquerque Journal, and mentioned in a letter from the Territorial Education Board that called it a valuable document of frontier educational history. 3 copies were donated to the Redemption Creek School Library, which caused James, at 15, the complicated social challenge of having his mother's book on the school shelf, which he navigated with a dignity she told him was impressive. Clara Rose, at 11, read the whole book in 4 days, and presented her mother with a detailed critique over supper that was more thoughtful than reviews Mary had received from adults. And Mary told her so, which made Clara Rose's face do something luminous that she immediately tried to contain because she was 11 and could not be seen to be unduly moved by parental praise. Frederick framed one of the review clippings and hung it in the kitchen next to a small drawing Thomas had made of the ranch when he was 9, which was the exact right place for it. In the summer of 1890, Redemption Creek celebrated its 30th anniversary as a settlement, which Eldon Briggs, still alderman and now considerably more weathered, organized with tremendous civic enthusiasm. There was a 2-day celebration with music and food and speeches, and a historical exhibition in the pavilion behind the church, and Mary was asked to read from her book, which she did in the late afternoon of the second day, with the golden light coming at a long angle through the pavilion posts, and the whole town gathered in the particular way of a community that has learned to show up for each other. She read the passage she had written about arriving on the stagecoach, the first sight of the territory through the dirty window glass, the way the landscape had been so much larger than anything she had imagined that it startled her every morning. She read about the schoolhouse and the children and the creek in October. She did not read the passages about Frederick because those felt too private for a public reading, but he was standing at the edge of the crowd in his good black coat, and she was aware of him there throughout. When she finished, the applause was the kind that does not come from politeness. Pedro Garza, who was 70 now and moved slowly but was entirely there, stood up to applaud, which was more than Mary could manage without looking away for a moment. She found Frederick afterward at the edge of the celebration, where the gathering was thinning into smaller groups in the cooling evening. He handed her a glass of lemonade and stood beside her and said nothing for a comfortable moment. "This is the town we chose," she said. "This is the town we made," he said, with the quiet precision that was characteristic of him at his best. She leaned against his arm. James was somewhere in the crowd with his friends. Clara Rose was at the far end of the pavilion conducting what appeared to be a serious conversation with Esperanza about something that involved significant gesturing. And Thomas and Isabella were sitting nearby with young James Frederick, who was almost a year old and examining a piece of bread with scientific thoroughness. "I'm happier than I had any right to expect to be," Mary said. "You had every right," Frederick said. "You just had to find it." She turned to look at him. He was 43 now, and the territory had added weather to his face in the way it added weather to everything, the lines of sun and wind and the particular depth that comes from years of looking at a large landscape. He was, she thought, exactly the age he was supposed to be. "I love you," she said, as directly as she said everything important. "I love you," he said, with the same unfussy fullness he had always brought to it. The sun went down over the western mesas in the long red sheets that never stopped being spectacular, and the Garza brothers played on into the evening, and the stars assembled themselves over the desert in their customary quantities, and Frederick and Mary Conroy stood at the edge of the town they had helped to make and watched the celebration, and held the evening, and each other with the same steady, attentive care they had always brought to the things that mattered most. The years that followed rounded themselves out with the fullness of a life, well lived, in a place that had asked everything and given more. James graduated from school at 17 and decided, with the same quiet certainty he brought to most decisions, that he wanted to study law, a choice that surprised no one who had watched him pay careful attention to every injustice he encountered and say so precisely. Mary wrote 3 more letters, the best of which was to a legal college in Albuquerque, and James was accepted in the fall. Clara Rose, at 15, was already teaching the youngest children at the school alongside her mother, not because she was asked to, but because she had decided to, and her manner in the classroom was remarkable, firm and warm and full of the particular intelligence that recognizes what each individual child needs and responds accordingly. Esperanza told Mary privately that Clara Rose was a natural teacher and that Redemption Creek was lucky, and Mary thought about what it meant to have grown this in a person, though she was honest enough to credit the person rather than herself. Frederick, at 45 and 46, was a man fully settled into what he was, and what he was good. He had handed more of the ranch's physical labor to Miguel Garza's son Roberto, who was 20 and strong and learning fast, not because Frederick could not do it, but because he had learned, with considerable assistance from his wife, that building something durable required thinking beyond yourself. He still rode the fence lines every morning and spent the better part of every day in physical work, but he was doing it alongside people now rather than entirely alone, and the ranch was stronger for it. Thomas and Isabella had 2 more children after young James Frederick, a girl named Elena for her grandmother and a boy named Marco, and the extended family of Conroys and their associates had expanded into something that required considerable logistical coordination at the holidays, which everyone managed with goodwill and moderate chaos, and an abundance of food that reflected the combined culinary traditions of Kentucky and New Mexico and Isabella's Pueblo heritage, which produced a table that Reverend Alcott, now very old and still entirely sincere, called an annual lesson in abundance. The widow Hannigan passed away peacefully in the winter of 1892 in her own bed with her cats around her, which was exactly as she would have wished. Mary sat with her in the last days and held her hand and told her that she had been the first kindness Redemption Creek had offered her, which was the truth, and the widow Hannigan, who was 91 and had earned everything, smiled at this with complete satisfaction. Her funeral was well attended, and her hymns were sung by the whole congregation, and Mary planted a small garden at the base of her headstone that bloomed every spring after. Redemption Creek in 1893 was not the same town Mary had ridden into on a stagecoach 19 years earlier, and it was also essentially the same town, which was one of the things she found most deeply true about places, the way they accumulate and change while keeping themselves. There were more buildings and more families and a proper doctor now, and a library that had grown from the 3 shelves in the schoolhouse to its own small room with donated books from all over. Esperanza's writing had made the town known in small ways beyond the territory. The school referenced in educational discussions in Santa Fe and Albuquerque as an example of what frontier education could accomplish with sufficient commitment. Mary was 43 years old and had been a schoolteacher in Redemption Creek for 19 years. She was the same woman who had arrived with a carpetbag and a derringer and a broken strap, and she was also someone who had been made by everything that had happened since. She walked to the schoolhouse every morning through the desert air, which still startled her sometimes with its quality of light, and she taught her students with the same full attention she had always given, and she came home to the ranch house on the western road and to Frederick, who was there at the end of every day with the same steady presence he had always had, like something the landscape had grown specifically for her. One evening, in the fall of 1893, she and Frederick sat on the porch of the ranch house in the cooling air, watching the sunset that they had watched together hundreds of times, and that had not once disappointed. The children, what children remained at home, were inside. The desert was going from gold to rose to deep red at the horizon. "I have been thinking," Frederick said. "About what?" "About that first Thursday in May, when you came into the general store and Della introduced us." "You were holding a bag of coffee beans," Mary said. He looked at her. "You remember that?" "I remember everything about the first month," she said. "I was paying very close attention." "So was I," he said. "I just didn't know what I was paying attention to yet." She looked at his profile in the fading light, the familiar lines of his face with 19 years of the territory in them. She thought about the advertisement cut from the back of the Missouri Democrat. She thought about the window of the stagecoach and the Red Rock canyons, and the way the landscape had been so large it startled her. She thought about a man turning from a shelf of goods with a bag of coffee beans and gray eyes the color of a sky before rain. "I knew before I admitted it," she said. "There was a moment on the bank of the creek early on. You were watching Thomas try to catch a crayfish, and your face was so unguarded, and I thought, that is a man I want to know for the rest of my life." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me." "It's just true," she said. He reached over and took her hand in the easy, familiar way of long habit that had never lost its meaning, and they sat together on the porch of the ranch house they had built their life in, watching the territory perform its nightly extravagance of color, the two of them quiet and full and entirely at home. Behind them through the window came the sounds of the house, Clara Rose's voice, the movement of someone in the kitchen, the distant sound of a horse in the barn. The stars were beginning to appear at the edges of the darkening sky, first one and then a dozen, and then far too many to count. The air smelled of sage and cooling earth, and very faintly of the cottonwoods down by the creek. Frederick Conroy held his wife's hand and looked out at the land that had never lied to him, the land they had worked together for 16 years, and felt the weight of it as the good weight of something real and lasting, the weight of a life that had held. Mary Talmadge Conroy, who had come to Redemption Creek in 1874 with nothing but herself and the specific feeling of possibility, leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and watched the stars accumulate over the New Mexico territory, each one finding its place in the enormous dark, and felt, as she had felt for 19 years in this wild and beautiful country, entirely and permanently home.